A 1945 photograph shows confident German soldiers, but when digitally enhanced in 2024, experts discover evidence of a betrayal that changed 12 destinies forever. And before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss any new videos. Dr. Klaus Weber adjusted his glasses while examining the dusty boxes that had just arrived at the Munich Institute of Contemporary History. It was a cold November morning in 2024, and these boxes contained the last German military archives from World War II that had remained undigitized. Among faded photographs of battles and official documents, one particular image caught his attention. The photograph showed 13 German soldiers posing in what appeared to be an improvised defensive position. Their uniforms were dirty and torn, their faces marked by exhaustion, but they maintained an upright military posture. In the center of the group, a sergeant with insignia from Battalion 847 held a command staff and looked directly at the camera with sunken but defiant eyes. On the back of the photograph, an inscription in faded ink read, "Battalion 847, Last Defenders of the Reich, April 28, 1945, outskirts of Berlin." Klaus frowned. He recognized the date, just 2 days before Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, when the German capital was practically surrounded by Soviet and American forces. Klaus carefully placed the photograph in the Institute's high-resolution scanner. The equipment hummed softly as it captured every detail of the 79-year-old image. On his computer screen appeared a crystal-clear, digitized version of the photograph. The soldiers' faces could be seen more clearly now, mostly young men, some barely teenagers, with expressions that mixed determination and terror. Something about the image troubled him, but he couldn't pinpoint what. The soldiers seemed positioned strangely, not like troops preparing for combat, but as if they were waiting for something specific. Klaus saved the digital file and continued with his work, but the image of Battalion 847 remained in his mind throughout the rest of the day. That afternoon, while organizing the digital archives, Klaus decided to examine the photograph more closely. He used the software's zoom function to analyze the uniforms, weapons, and expressions of the soldiers. It was then that he noticed something that made him hold his breath. The sergeant in the center had something white, barely visible, protruding from beneath his military jacket near the left shoulder. The next day, Klaus arrived early at the institute, obsessed with what he had seen in the photograph. He immediately went to his computer and opened the image of Battalion 847. This time, he carefully adjusted the contrast and brightness to examine the white object he had noticed on the sergeant's uniform. What he saw left him speechless. It was definitely an improvised white armband, barely visible but unmistakable. Klaus had studied enough military history to know the meaning of that symbol. It was the universal signal of surrender that German soldiers wore when they surrendered to Allied forces, but that didn't make sense. According to the inscription on the photograph, these were the last defenders of the Reich, loyal soldiers preparing for heroic resistance. Why would the sergeant be hiding a symbol of surrender? Klaus enlarged the image further, meticulously examining every detail. In the sergeant's upper right pocket, he noticed a partially protruding folded document. The digitization quality was high enough to distinguish part of an official seal, but he couldn't identify which organization it came from. Intrigued, Klaus contacted his colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, a specialist in World War II military documentation. Elizabeth arrived an hour later and examined the image with the same meticulous attention. "This is very strange," Elizabeth murmured after several minutes of analysis. "The composition of the photograph, the soldier's posture, it doesn't seem like a typical propaganda image from the regime's final days. There's something deliberately staged about it." Elizabeth pointed out other suspicious details. Several soldiers had their hands positioned unnaturally, as if they were hiding something. Two of them were looking nervously to the left of the frame, as if expecting someone to arrive. And most notably, None of the soldiers had their weapons in combat position, despite supposedly preparing to defend Berlin. "We need more information about this Battalion 847, said Elizabeth, "and about the exact circumstances in which this photograph was taken." Klaus nodded. "I'm going to search the German military archives and also the Allied records. If these soldiers were planning to surrender, there must be some record of prior contact." That afternoon, Klaus immersed himself in the Institute's digital archives, searching for any mention of Battalion 847 in the final days of April 1945. Klaus spent 3 days searching for references to Battalion 847 in German military archives. What he found was surprisingly scarce and contradictory. According to the official records of the Wehrmacht High Command, the battalion had been completely destroyed in heroic combat on April 29, 1945, 1 day after the photograph was taken. However, the details of the supposed final combat were vague and didn't match battle reports from other units in the area. There were no mentions of enemy casualties, captured trophies, or any other details typical of military reports from that era. Klaus decided to search the digitized American archives. After obtaining the necessary permissions, he accessed U.S. Army records corresponding to operations near Berlin in April 1945. What he found left him perplexed. In the archive of the 86th Airborne Division, dated April 25, 1945, he found an entry that read, "Contact established with elements of German Battalion 847. They request surrender terms. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell authorizes preliminary negotiations." 3 days before the photograph, soldiers from Battalion 847 had initiated secret contact with American forces. Klaus continued searching and found more related entries. April 26. Battalion 847 provides information about German defensive positions in Sector 7G. In exchange, requests guarantees of safety for families. April 27th. Preliminary agreement reached with Battalion 847. Surrender scheduled for April 30th at previously agreed coordinates. April 28th. Contact lost with Battalion 847. They did not appear at scheduled meeting point. The date of the last entry coincided exactly with the date inscribed on the photograph. Klaus leaned back in his chair, processing the information. The last battalion had not been preparing for heroic resistance. It had been secretly negotiating its surrender in exchange for valuable military information. Klaus immediately called Elizabeth. "I think we have a case of betrayal," he told her, "but I'm not sure who betrayed whom." Elizabeth arrived at the Institute that same afternoon. Together, they examined the photograph again, in light of this new information. Now the scene had a completely different meaning. It wasn't an image of loyal soldiers preparing for the final battle, but a photograph taken moments before a planned surrender that never occurred. Klaus and Elizabeth decided to investigate the individual identities of the soldiers in the photograph. They began with the sergeant in the center, whose full name appeared in some documents as Heinrich Müller. Using genealogical resources and German municipal archives, they began tracing his personal history. Heinrich Müller had been born in 1920 in a small town near Dresden. He had been drafted in 1940 and had served on various fronts before being assigned to Battalion 847 in March 1945. His military file showed a competent but not exceptional soldier, with no mentions of valor or particular heroic acts. However, Klaus found something interesting in the civilian archives. Heinrich's wife, Anna Müller, had given birth to their first child in February 1945. The soldier had powerful personal motivations to survive the war and return to his family. Elizabeth located Heinrich's official death records. According to German documents, he had died in combat on April 29, 1945, along with the rest of his battalion. But when they searched Allied prisoner of war records, they found no mention of his death or capture. "It's as if he disappeared completely," observed Elizabeth, "officially dead according to the Germans, but with no record of death or capture by the Allies." Klaus had an idea. What if Heinrich managed to escape? If the betrayal that prevented the battalion's surrender also allowed him to flee, they decided to search post-war records. In the Refugee and Displaced Persons Archives of the American Occupation Zone, Klaus found an intriguing entry. Heinrich Müller, age 25, from Dresden, reported as civilian survivor seeking family reunification, March 1946. The entry included an address in a rural area of Bavaria. Klaus realized that Heinrich had survived, had assumed a civilian identity, and had managed to reunite with his family after the war. But why had he survived when his comrades had died? Elizabeth examined the photograph again, paying special attention to Heinrich's position in relation to the other soldiers. "Look at his posture," she said. "He's not looking in the same direction as the others. He's slightly apart from the group, as if he knew something the others didn't know." Klaus nodded. "I think Heinrich knew the surrender had been compromised. The question is, was he the one who alerted the Nazi authorities about his battalion's plans?" Klaus decided to try to locate Heinrich Müller's descendants. Using the refugee records as a starting point, he traced the family through post-war municipal archives. He discovered that Heinrich and Anna had settled in a small town near Munich, where Heinrich had worked as a carpenter until his death in 1987. The genealogical search revealed that Heinrich and Anna had had 3 more children after the war. Their eldest son, Hans, born in February 1945, still lived in Munich and worked as a retired engineer. Klaus contacted Hans Müller by phone, explaining his research about the Battalion 847 photograph. Hans remained silent for a long moment before responding with a trembling voice. "My father never spoke about the war, never. When I was a child and asked him, he would simply say he had done things he wasn't proud of." Hans agreed to meet with Klaus the next day. They met at a cafe near downtown Munich. Hans had brought with him a small wooden box containing his father's personal effects. "After he died, we found this hidden in the basement," Hans explained, opening the box. "We never knew what it meant." Inside the box were military medals, family photographs from before the war, and a sealed envelope addressed, "For my children, if they ever need to know the truth." Hans had never opened the envelope. "Could we open it now?" Klaus asked carefully. Hans nodded nervously. Inside the envelope was a 4-page handwritten letter, dated December 1960. Klaus read it aloud. "My dear children, if you are reading this, it means the time has finally come to know the truth about what I did in the war's final days. I am not the hero you might have thought I was. I am a coward and a traitor who saved his own life at the cost of his comrades." The letter continued describing the events of April 1945. Heinrich confirmed that the battalion had established secret contact with American forces and had agreed to surrender in exchange for military information. But the night before the scheduled surrender, Heinrich had changed his mind. "I was afraid the Americans wouldn't keep their promise to protect our families," he wrote. "I was afraid of being tried as a war criminal, so I made the most cowardly decision of my life. I alerted the SS about our plans." Klaus continued reading Heinrich's letter aloud, while Hans listened with growing horror. "That morning of April 28th, a military photographer came to document our heroic last battalion. I knew that by afternoon, the SS would come to arrest my comrades for treason. The photograph was taken while they still believed they would surrender that night to the Americans. I wore the white armband hidden to maintain appearances, but I had already sealed their fate." The letter described how Heinrich had secretly contacted an SS officer the night before, revealing the battalion's surrender plans in exchange for a promise that he would be discreetly transferred to another unit and reported as missing in combat. "After the photograph was taken, I pretended to go scout the terrain. Instead, I met with the SS contact who was waiting for me 1 kilometer away. He gave me false civilian papers and a transit pass. While I fled toward American lines disguised as a civilian refugee, the SS arrested my 12 comrades. Heinrich described hearing the gunshots from a distance. That same afternoon, his companions had been executed immediately, without trial, accused of treason against the Reich. I reached American lines the next day, telling them I was a civilian who had lost his family in the bombing. The Americans registered me as a refugee. They never suspected I was Sergeant Heinrich Müller of Battalion 847, officially dead in combat. The letter continued describing how Heinrich had lived with this guilt for 15 years before writing the confession. Hans had tears in his eyes. "My God," he whispered, "my father was a murderer. He killed his own comrades to save his skin." Klaus carefully closed the letter. "The photograph we found doesn't show the last heroic defenders of the Reich. It shows 12 innocent men posing for what would be their last photograph, betrayed by the man they trusted." Elizabeth, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "Heinrich lived 42 more years after the war. He married, had children, built a normal life. His 12 comrades died at 18, 19, 20 years old, shot as traitors when they were actually victims of their own sergeant's betrayal." Hans looked at the photograph Klaus had brought. Now he could see what the experts had noticed. His father was slightly separated from the group. His posture was different, his expression less confident than his companions. It was the body language of someone who knew a terrible secret. Klaus and Elizabeth decided to investigate the identities of the other 12 soldiers from Battalion 847. Using the enlarged photograph and German military records, they managed to identify 10 of them. All were young men between 18 and 23 years old, most from small towns in eastern Germany. The youngest soldier was Wolfgang Schmid, barely 17 years old, who had lied about his age to enlist. The oldest was Franz Weber, 23 years old, a medical student who had been drafted in his final university year. Klaus contacted the descendant families of these soldiers. Most had lived for decades, believing their ancestors had died as heroes defending Berlin. The truth was much more complex and painful. Maria Schmidt, Wolfgang's granddaughter, was initially skeptical when Klaus contacted her. "My grandfather was barely a child," she said. "How could he have been involved in secret negotiations with the Americans?" But when Klaus showed her the evidence, the enlarged photograph, the American records, Heinrich's confession, Maria began to understand. "My grandmother always said Wolfgang was different from other Nazi soldiers, that he had been forced to fight in a war he didn't understand." Elizabeth located Thomas Weber, grandson of Franz Weber, the medical student. Thomas was a doctor, as his grandfather had hoped to be. "Franz had written to my grandmother saying he hoped to end the war soon and return to complete his studies," Thomas explained. "She kept his letters her entire life. In the last one, dated a week before his death, he wrote about an opportunity to do something good for the first time in this war." Klaus realized that Franz's letter probably referred to the surrender plans. The soldiers of Battalion 847 had not been Nazi fanatics preparing for suicidal resistance. They had been desperate young men looking for a way to survive a lost war and return to their families. Heinrich condemned them to death not only out of personal cowardice, Elizabeth reflected, but because he robbed 12 families of the possibility of reuniting with their children after the war. Klaus examined the photograph again, now seeing each soldier as an individual with a name, family, and dreams of survival. The image had gone from being a neutral historical document to becoming evidence of a deeply personal tragedy. Klaus decided to present his findings to Germany's Ministry of Justice. Although Heinrich Müller had died decades ago, the case had important historical implications for the official recognition of victims of internal military betrayal during the Third Reich's final days. The prosecutor specializing in historical crimes, Dr. Peter Engel, reviewed all the evidence Klaus had compiled: the enlarged photograph, the American records, Heinrich's confession, and testimonies from descendant families. "This is a unique case," Dr. Engel explained. "Most military betrayal cases we investigate involve German soldiers betraying the Reich. This case shows a soldier betraying his own comrades to save his life, resulting in the unjust execution of 12 innocent men. The ministry decided to open an official posthumous investigation. Although criminal charges couldn't be filed against Heinrich, the case could result in official rehabilitation of the 12 executed soldiers and compensation for their families. During the investigation, more details emerged about Battalion 847's final days. SS records, discovered in recently declassified archives, confirmed that Heinrich had personally contacted Sturmbannführer Klaus Dietrich on the night of April 27, 1945. Dietrich's report described the encounter. Sergeant Müller provided detailed information about his unit's treason plans. In exchange for this vital information for the Reich's security, he was granted exemption from execution and civilian identity documents to facilitate his escape. Dr. Engel also discovered that Heinrich had provided the SS not only information about his own comrades, but also details about American defensive positions that the battalion had observed during their secret negotiations. This information had resulted in the deaths of American soldiers in subsequent combat. Heinrich Müller was not just a traitor to his German comrades, Dr. Engel concluded. He also betrayed the American forces who had trusted him to negotiate the surrender. His betrayal had lethal consequences on both sides of the conflict. 6 months after the investigation began, the German Ministry of Justice published an official 200-page report titled The Battalion 847 Case, Betrayal, Survival, and Posthumous Justice in the Third Reich's Final Days. The report officially rehabilitated the 12 executed soldiers, recognizing them not as traitors to the German state, but as victims of personal betrayal by their sergeant. Their families were declared eligible for historical compensation for the injustice suffered. Klaus organized a commemorative ceremony at Munich's military cemetery. The descendant families of the 12 soldiers met for the first time, united by a shared tragedy that had remained hidden for 79 years. Hans Müller, Heinrich's son, attended the ceremony to present official apologies on behalf of his father. "My father lived his entire adult life with the guilt of what he had done," he said with a broken voice. "But that guilt doesn't bring back the lives of the men he betrayed, nor restore the decades their families lost without them." Maria Schmidt, Wolfgang's granddaughter, read the names of the 12 executed soldiers. Wolfgang Schmidt, 17 years old, Franz Weber, 23 years old, Karl Hoffmann, 19 years old. Each name represented an interrupted life, a destroyed family, a betrayal that had remained hidden for nearly 8 decades. Elizabeth presented the enlarged photograph as a permanent part of the Institute's World War II exhibition. "This image reminds us that history is not always what it appears on the surface," she explained to attendees. "Sometimes modern technology can reveal truths that remained hidden for generations." Klaus reflected on the impact of his discovery. A simple archival photograph had revealed a complex story of betrayal, survival, guilt, and delayed justice. The last heroic defenders of the Reich had been revealed as victims of betrayal by someone they completely trusted. The photograph now carried a new, explanatory plaque: Battalion 847, April 28, 1945. 12 German soldiers executed for treason after being betrayed by their own sergeant, officially rehabilitated in 2024. 1 year after the initial discovery, Klaus found himself in his office at the Institute of Contemporary History, looking at the Battalion 847 photograph that now hung on the main wall. The image had been reproduced in history books, documentaries, and museum exhibitions around the world. The story had resonated internationally because it illustrated the moral complexities of war and how official historical narratives often hide more complicated truths. The heroes and villains of history are rarely as simple as they appear in official photographs. Hans Müller had established a foundation in memory of the 12 betrayed soldiers, financing historical research to reveal similar cases of military injustice during World War II. "My father destroyed 12 lives to save his own," Hans explained in an interview. "The least I can do is help other hidden truths come to light." The families of the 12 soldiers had formed a support group, sharing family stories and documents they had kept for decades without fully understanding their meaning. Many had discovered letters, photographs, and personal effects that now took on new significance in light of the revealed truth. Elizabeth had expanded her research using image analysis technology to examine thousands of German military photographs in search of similar evidence of incorrect historical narratives. Her work had resulted in the identification of several additional cases where official circumstances of death or heroism didn't match photographic evidence. Klaus received a letter from an American military museum requesting his collaboration to examine photographs of American soldiers from the same era. The technique of detailed analysis of historical images was becoming a standard tool for historical research. But for Klaus, the most significant impact of the discovery was personal. The Battalion 847 photograph had taught him that history is not just events and dates, but about individual human decisions that have lasting consequences. Heinrich Müller had made a cowardly decision in a moment of terror, and that decision had affected 12 families for nearly 8 decades. The finally revealed truth couldn't bring back the lives of the 12 soldiers or completely repair their families' pain, but it could restore their dignity, correct the historical record, and serve as a reminder that justice, even when it arrives late, is still justice. Klaus looked one last time at the enlarged photograph. The faces of the 12 soldiers no longer seemed anonymous to him. They were Wolfgang, Franz, Karl, and the other young men who had sought an honorable way to survive a terrible war, only to be betrayed by someone they had trusted. Their story, silenced for 79 years, had finally been heard.